Today I'll be talking about greatness in StarCraft 2. And if you want to be great, you should go to our Patreon at patreon.com/slingshot_esports. Now, after the plug, here's the topic for today. It's something I've been thinking about. It's been something I actually covered a long time ago. It's about the greatest players of all time in StarCraft 2. But specifically, this will be narrowing it down to players I consider transcendent. And what I mean by transcendent is you can go across like the entire history of StarCraft 2, and there's no player that can match their accomplishments in what they did relative to their eras, or what they just did overall time. Or basically, if this player didn't exist, I don't think any player could have ever replicated what they accomplished. So, in the current standings of StarCraft 2 and it's been running for about 7 years now, I think there are only 4 transcendent players, and I'll talk about them each, and then I'll explain about the player I left out because that's currently the hot topic. So the first player obviously is MVP, and I guess I'll start off with the criteria I've generally used. It's the same as the greatest of all time list. So it's basically your tournament placings, but more importantly, the meta you are playing in and the players you are playing against. So I counted like top 10s, top 10 of each race, or top 5 of each race, or top X of overall. And that's an incredibly important piece of criteria that I don't think a lot of people give enough weight to. Secondly is, of course, like the meta. Third is like the competition overall during the time. And then relative to how many like players there are, for instance, I feel like people give a bit too much discredit to the earlier parts of StarCraft 2 because they just assume it was very easy to learn or create all of the meta, and it's not. I'm not sure where that idea comes from. At the same time, people assume that it's easier to play at an international LAN event. I don't think that's the case. I think it offers a different type of scenario, a different type of circumstance, and while it doesn't add the complexity of preparation that like a GSL does, it creates a certain level of stress and a certain type of its own aura that some players have never been really able to crack into, like no matter how great they were. So like beyond like the top 3, there are very few players that have top 3 basically. There are very few players that have ever been incredibly great at both the international circuit and the GSL circuit. So just keep that in mind. So for MVP, the specific reason I've always considered him transcendent is 2011 was obviously a masterpiece. It's still, I'd say it's the second most dominant or third most dominant. It depends on the length of time. So for instance, I think Life was the most dominant era player, and then after that it's either depending on your criteria, it could be either Zest or MVP. And I think you have to give a nod to Zest in this case, just because I feel he played in a stronger time, just because of the Kespa thing. Even though there were less, I'd argue there'd probably be like less players, but it wasn't enough to affect it. So beyond that, like MVP's 2011 run would have already made him one of the greatest of all time. But the reason he is a transcendent player in a way nobody has ever matched in StarCraft 2 is because of his 2012 run, where he was injured. He played his worst matchups. He played against the worst meta of all time, Broodlord Infestor. I still don't know how like not everybody's not like screaming at the rooftops. Like this was such bullshit. But Broodlord Infestor was the absolute worst. It was a strategic dead end for all races, where it was obvious, where you no longer required thinking so much. And what I mean by that is there is no situation in which making an Infestor was a bad move. So that's the best way to put it. It's how Thorn puts it, and I think it's the most eloquent way to put it, because there is literally no situation I could think of where making an Infestor was the bad strategic move or the bad tactical move in any game I've seen during that entire period. And MVP, like he fought it. He got to a GSL finals twice during this broken down period. He beat the European Zergs at the IEM, and I'll go ahead and say this: I actually think if we time traveled every great Korean player that was not Zerg and sent it back to that time without the knowledge that like MVP or Rain or Parting creates, I think they all lose to the patch zergs of that era. Like, it doesn't matter where they come from. That's just my personal opinion. You can take it or not. So that's why I've always considered like MVP an all-time great player, because his 2012 is like a masterpiece that's never been even been close to replicated in the entire history of StarCraft 2. I mean, to be fair, like, in order to replicate it, you'd have to have some terrible shit go down. But even outside of that, I haven't seen something even close to that kind of level of like run where everything was stacked against one guy and he won or nearly won a bunch of times when he shouldn't have been able to get close to that. So I give the nod for MVP as like the first Transcendent player. The second one goes to Life, the guy I consider the second greatest of all time. Some still consider him the greatest of all time, and there's a very strong argument for that. But basically, Life is... I consider him the most talented prodigy that ever touched the game of StarCraft 2. It's actually... Yeah, and then he ends his like career with the match fixing scandal. And yeah, that was a shitty thing to do, and obviously he's been punished for that, but I just think it's kind of weird that everybody's trying to forget he existed. So I'll go ahead and say this. I think Life is the greatest Zerg that ever was, the greatest Zerg that ever has been, and arguably the greatest Zerg that will ever be in StarCraft 2. Actually, there's one caveat to that, and I'll get to him later, but in terms of just pure dominance, in terms of results, I actually, for certain, that Life is that person, Life is that player. And Life, like MVP, has played well in every single meta that was good for him and bad for him. So he played great during the Brutal Infestor era, but when it switched over to like Hellbats, he was pretty good against that. And like basically, even though he doesn't have like this period of like super dominance against terrible metas, it had less to do with the meta so much as it had to do with his like rigor, his interest, his motivation, whatever you want to call it. Like he was very laissez-faire with StarCraft 2, where he was either into it or he wasn't. And if he wasn't into it, he'd just be like, oh, whatever. And then he'd get like decent results. If he was into it, he'd start dominating everything. So that's basically how you can explain like his peaks and valleys throughout his entire StarCraft 2 career. And tactically speaking, he was the most important player to ever touch, the most important Zerg player to ever touch a StarCraft 2. He basically changed Zerg vs Terran, Zerg vs Zerg, and Zerg vs Protoss with his counterattack style and his way of like setting up flanks, setting up misdirections, controlling the eyes of the opponents. There's nobody that's been better than him. There's nobody that's been even close to him in that regard. And you'd have to watch like what happened before him, where it was basically like, yes, Idra, Nest-T, like style, macro up, defend everything, and then fight. Whereas lifestyle was fight, but only fight on your own, only fight on your own terms. So you'd always be in this aggressive stance. But if the fight was favorable for them, he wouldn't be there. He'd be somebody somewhere else. And then by the time you turned around, he'd be there again and he'd kill you. That was a very specific style. And then he was also surprisingly decent at like these late game scenarios with like Swarm Host and Brutal Infestor. Obviously, Brutal Infestor he's good at, but I'm not sure he ever particularly liked that style. He's just something it's just something you had to use. Something you had to use, right? And I think I said this earlier in the video. I think he had the single most dominant period of any single StarCraft 2 player from his BlizzCon victory. I think it was 2014. Yeah, I think it was 2014. To the end of... Alright, I got to the like beginning of 2015. And then let me read off like the results. It was like won the global finals, got second at DreamHack winner to 4GG, I think. And then SSL 1, he lost to Dream. Like this epic fucking series where I think he would have won the entire thing if Dream didn't stop him. He won GSL 1, he won IN Taipei. He would have won SSL 2 except Dream played out of his fucking mind and stopped him again. And then he lost in like the Kespa Cup top 4. Also the tournament where he did match throw one of the games. But I think that is the single most dominant period I've ever seen from a StarCraft 2 player, especially because I think that was I was still like extremely high competitive era. I think the most competitive is generally like the 2013 to 2014 period, and then after that, like people start dropping off, not because of practice, but because of retirements and money and stuff like this. So, I think that's the most dominant period. And if you wanted to call Life the greatest of all time, that's probably the period you point to as to why he would be the greatest. Whereas like if you wanted to point to MVP as the greatest of all time, you point to his like 2012 Miracle Run. So, and then in terms of criteria, there in terms of criteria, in terms of like players beaten, MVP and Life basically like tower over everybody else. And the third closest person is Tasia, and Tasia is also on this list of a player I consider transcendent in a very different way. Now, there is no player that has ever been as good at international lands in the history of StarCraft 2 as Tasia. Not Life, not MVP. On top of that, he has the best consistency peak of any player. If you don't count his like GSL or like WCS runs. As in, and what I mean by that as it is, if you sent him to like a foreign land, he could beat literally everybody and anybody, and he did it over and over and over and over again. And he did this for 2 years, from 2013 to 2014, basically. And there's only like a few months respite, like a few like odd months in between each run. So it's not even. It feels like a very long continuous run, honestly. And there's like I think. I remember there was this giant argument in 2013 and like when we were trying to figure out who was the best player for that year, and then we ended up with Tasia because Tasia had beaten so many people that it was like, okay, you can nominate another player who won the GSL like INnoVation, but if you list the people they beat, like Tasia like whipped him by far. So it was like, is that even like yeah, GSL might be more prestigious, but is it more prestigious than beating like 10 extra players at that level? Like we're talking like top 5 players in the world, right? So it was like, can't really do that, can you? That's always been like my biggest point of concern with that was like, Tasia was such an extreme example of like a player who was incredible in the international lands and like okay at GSLs. Like he had some decent finishes, particularly during the Broodlord Infestor era, but beyond that, like he was never a great like prep player. Not until like the very end of his career when he went on one last like BlizzCon run where he beat SC2 and INnoVation back to back GSL final when they were both more GSL finalists. So that's something in of itself. So if you want to consider Life the greatest of all time, you just have to point to the fact that he was so consistently dominant for a long period of time in his specific area for 2 years, which is longer than Life, longer than MVP. And then in the exact same fashion but opposite of Tasia, except in like the different arena, you have to go to SC2. Now, this will probably be my most controversial pick for like a transcendent player. But SC2 basically proved to me, like, even though he hasn't won any GSL he's been to, which is a tragedy in of itself, there is a very strong argument to say that SC2 is, in terms of consistent peak, the best player we've ever seen in StarCraft 2. He's basically spent his period from 2013, the end of 2013 to the end of 2014 lasts about 1.25 years, which is the longest peak anybody in StarCraft 2 has maintained for that period of time. So like I said, Tasia had months off. Life was up and down all the time. MVP, like, yeah, he was good for like the first year, but then he had injuries, and I actually don't think you can extend it, even though he made it and won the GSL Season 2 finals of 2012. I don't think you can count that as like a continuous run, whereas with SC2 you can count that as continuous run because he wasn't dropping off. He was like getting to the finals over and over and over again. And then later on in this year, 2017, he made a comeback, and he also won Kestel Cup, and his international lands weren't actually that bad overall, even though he's been to incredibly few, like very, very few of them, like only a handful over his entire career. So yeah, that's SC2 for you. He doesn't have the amount of top players beaten like Tasia, Life, or MVP, but if you wanted to point to him and say this guy's the greatest of all time, despite the fact that he's never won a GSL finals and he's basically only won one Kespa Cup in his entire career, you can make that argument just off of the fact that his peak consistency is out of this fucking world, especially in the GSLs, and he's basically beating everybody with his style of play. So, in different metas in different eras. Now, you'll have noticed I said there are 4 Transcendent players, and somebody will probably ask me, what about INnoVation? And here's the inherent problem with INnoVation. I actually like him as a player. I don't know why everybody thinks I hate him, but whatever. So the thing about INnoVation is he doesn't really have an era where you can say he's transcendent. So he doesn't have a super dominant era like Life. Like, do you think it's now in 2017? Well, in 2017, let me see here exactly. He won GSL at season 3. He won SL season 1, and he won GSL versus the world. Like, whereas Life was like BlizzCon, GSL 1, Taipei, like and in a much harder era, and then he was getting like top finishes everywhere. Whereas INnoVation, he was getting knocked out early in GSL season 1, GSL season 2, SSL season 2, Shanghai. Like, these are okay results, but when you're talking about the greatest of all time, that's not enough, especially if you consider the relative overall competitive scene, especially when you're comparing it to Life. And then the other problem is, like, okay, I actually don't think this is his most competitive like peak. I actually think his most competitive peak was in 2013, but in the end, like, he's like got what, like, he lost to Sulky, then he won the season 1 finals, and then he lost to Maru in season 2, and then he dropped off. That only lasted for like 4 to 6 months. Depends on how far you want to stretch it. So even then, that's not comparable at all to Life. And then he doesn't have the there's no point like in his career where he has like a miracle run like MVP. There's no, I can't think of any. So he isn't transcendent in that way. And yeah, you could talk about here's the thing, like, people talk as if like it's easy to kick ass at being a meta you're strong in. It's not really, but I mean, but you have to do more than what INnoVation has done with his strong eras, because you're trying to beat, like, if you're trying to be the greatest of all time anyway, or trying to make an argument for the greatest of all time, you have to transcend one of these 4. I think you have to transcend one of these 4 in a specific way, and he doesn't transcend MVP in this way at all. And people bring up like the fact that MVP had a bunch of tournaments in 2011. True, that's true. I should also point out INnoVation has had a much longer career than MVP. MVP's playing career either lasts 2 to 3 years. I consider it 2 just because of the injuries. But if you want, you consider it 3, even though he only went to like 1 or 2, like a few LAN events at the end of his career. INnoVation has been playing since 2012 to now. So he went to a foreign team. He actually played in a bunch of international lands. Wasn't able to win that many of them during his time on Acer. So it's like that also hurts him. So basically, INnoVation has had plenty of time to prove he's had plenty. He has had plenty of chances. So I'm not sure where that like idea comes from. He's had way more chances than MVP. About equivalent chances to Tasia and Life, or less or more. I haven't exactly counted, and way more chances than Sue. So that's also something you have to consider if you're trying to count it that way, just in terms of time. So not greater than MVP in MVP's greatest feat. And if you want, you can go ahead and count the top 10 players he's played in every single one of his like deep runs. I cut it at top 4 usually for this, but basically he's trumped by Tasia, Life, and MVP by a lot still. And yes, I counted all of his recent paths of his recent tournaments. So there's that too. And then finally, you come to Tasia, and like I said, INnoVation did have a lot of chances, and he lost to Tasia a bunch of times. So there's no excuse. Like, even head to head, like basically INnoVation went to Acer during his supposed peak, and then he lost in a bunch of these international lands. At the same time, he basically tried to do what Tasia did, except he failed. So that's also another weird like facet of this argument. Is like as like I'm not sure why we're creating this weird double standard where, oh, it's so easy for Tasia to do all of this, but then INnoVation does it and nobody brings this up. Like that's actually one of those like one of the sticking points for INnoVation is like in terms of international LAN success, he only has Gyeonggi from this year, and that's about it. Like, oh, I guess he had Gamescom where that was really easy, but then like that was like only like one or two good players at that one. But beyond that, he's only had a few deep runs, but he's never won anything, and Taja's won a shitload. So, and yeah, it's kind of like I said, it's kind of like weird to put it that way. But if you're trying to be the greatest of all time, you have to transcend the greatest of all time, and he doesn't transcend Taja in that aspect. Okay, so what about consistent peak? Like I said, 6 months. 6 months in 2013. In 2014, he had the last GSL. 2015, last GSL. So that's like a month, like a few months each in those. But beyond that, like it's only like one tournament. Or I guess 2015, he also had the Gamescom MSI, but MSI was like just the top four. Wasn't even that strong of a tournament either. So he didn't really have any runs in 2014 or 2015. He just had two really good tournaments. 2016, nothing. Apparently, he was playing League of Legends this entire year. 2017 is really good, I think. But even then, like I said, like it wasn't dominant. It wasn't dominant enough for my taste. And if you just look at the number of chances he had, it's actually a similar amount to the chances MVP had. And I think they're similar-ish eras. I actually think MVP's is harder, but because of the fact that he has to like learn and create everything, and there's more players. But whereas like in this year era, there's like more refinement. There's more refinement because everybody knows more about the entire game and the way it works. So it either balances out, or I think it might balance more towards MVP. It's up to you to think about that. But the fact is, like, he's had as many chances as MVP did back then, and hasn't like made much of it relative to MVP. So that's like another knock against INnoVation in that sense. So there, and finally, I think even if you ignore all these arguments I've made about why I don't think INnoVation is a transcendent player, the biggest one I think is Life. Like, because the two of them have very similar career paths. They both start off with an incredibly strong, like, dominant streak. INnoVation is 2013. Life is end of 2012 to the beginning of 2013. They both make small comebacks. Life at the end of 2013 to the beginning of 2014. Then INnoVation, like the GSL at the end of 2014 at the end of 2015. But Life's comebacks are always like way hotter, way stronger. He always gets way more results during his comebacks. And then like his most dominant period is like out trumps INnoVation's most dominant periods by a shitload. So I feel like, and finally it's the fact that Life did all this in what I think was arguably the hardest like peaks of competition in StarCraft 2 history. So in order for INnoVation to like be transcendent, he has to do more. As what I'm getting at is he has to dominate in a way that nobody's ever dominated before. And in his current streak, I don't think I think that's his like pathway in order to become like a transcendent player of this game. Is he has to, like, he isn't going to make some stupid miracle like MVP. His consistent peak is good, but it's not nearly as good as Sue. Like, he is, like, he is nearly not nearly as good as Sue's, because Sue's like getting like 4 GSL finals in a row. That's like that's untouchable shit. Tasia, he can't. There's no way he can match Tasia. Like, the scene isn't even like able to like isn't even at a place where he could like match Tasia's incredible results in international lands. So his only like chance, I think, is he has to dominate in a way nobody else has dominated before, and he has to, in that sense, he has to like overcome what Life did at the end of 2014 to the beginning of 2015, and I haven't seen it yet. Like, it's good, but I don't think it's close at all. And those are just my thoughts about it. I still think INnoVation is an all-time great player. I don't know why people think I hate him, but I think you have to, when you're trying to look into what makes an all-time great player, you have to understand that, like the greatest of all-time players, you have to understand that there isn't necessarily one argument for one person at all, even though I chose MVP. But I can make an argument for case for Tasia or Sue or Life. But you have to have some kind of feat, some kind of incredible something that is literally incomparable to everybody else in order to get to this, like, in order to get this, like, nomination vote, so to speak. And right now, as INnoVation currently is, throughout his entire career, I don't think he's made anything like that yet. So those are my thoughts. See you later.